Thanks to Gemma and for her introduction, also to the ESRC for the funding that's helping us put on this fantastic seminar series, and a really warm welcome to everybody for joining us from what is a very, at the moment, bright and sunny Brighton, and what promises to be a really great presentation. Following in the tradition of these debates, we're going to be thinking a bit about how digital technologies are transforming work and the impacts of that. I'm Rachel Verdin. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Digital Futures at Work Research Centre at the University of Sussex, and I'm really delighted to be welcoming Nimmi Patel today to talk about diversity in the tech sector. Nimmi works as a policy manager for skills, talent and diversity at a firm called techUK, and they're a trade organisation who works to expand the skills, talent and opportunity in the digital sector. And Nimmi's work there shows her real commitment to embedding diversity in the UK tech pipeline all the way from the classroom to the boardroom. Alongside her role there, she's also studying at King's College London for an MA in Strategic Communications. And Nimmi's going to be speaking today for about 20-25 minutes, and then there's going to be plenty of time for questions afterwards. But for now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nimmi for her presentation titled Diversity and Digital Inclusion, Developing an Inclusive Agenda for Digital Futures at Work. Nimmi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and that's an incredibly long title. I apologise about that. Hi, everyone. I hope you are somewhere warm with something warm to drink as well. It's really important nowadays. As Rachel mentioned, I work for a tech organisation, or a tech adjacent organisation, a tech trade association, in fact, with over 830 members. And our members sort of range from the large global corporates of the world all the way down to SMEs. And I would say around 66%, so 2/3 of our membership are actually SMEs. And as Rachel mentioned, I'm going to be talking about how diversity and inclusion are essential considerations for those who write our digital future, and how we can only thrive as our voices are heard. I do apologize if you've heard some of these statistics before. I think that just shows how much research actually needs to be how much more research needs to be done in the diversity and inclusion space, especially when we talk about the future of work. Now, the reason I agreed to speak to you, and thank you so much to everyone at Digit for their fantastic work and research on this so far, is because I believe we're at a crossroads, and that we're not just talking about diversity, inclusion and equality anymore. We're talking about building an equitable economy. And in particular, everything I say has a tech sector angle to it, naturally. So I'm talking about building an equitable tech sector. In particular, around building this world where the pandemic has disproportionately affected different groups of society. Now, we know technology can be a force for good. That cannot be denied. We've seen it during the heights of the pandemic and the first few initial lockdowns, and we see it every day in the work that we do, or at least I hope we do. Now we have a collective chance and an obligation to ensure that the use of technology in our businesses and our lives and our society is brought around for positive change on a national scale. You may be asking, why is this needed? Well, the COVID-19 crisis led to the UK government to exempt companies from having to file their gender pay gap data last year. And as a result, only half did. For those who may not know, the UK government previously mandated that gender pay gap reporting was mandatory for companies with over 250 employees. So that's sort of your larger businesses here in the UK. The reason for this push for data collection is that with data, we cut through our assumptions. That's how we measure, and that's how we sort of focus our analysis on. And despite the fact that only half companies, from the year before did provide their gender pay gap reportings, that analysis of the ones that did provide data suggested it would take almost 200 years to close the gender pay gap. And if I'm really honest, I don't want to be having the same conversations on diversity and inclusion and equity in 10 years, let alone 200. As a quick aside, the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London have some fantastic research on analysing the gender pay gap reporting systems across the world, which you should check out, and I'll happily put in the chat afterwards. The main thing that I want to discuss today after, oh, I'm just trying to next slide. There you go. The main thing that I want to highlight is that for tech to work, it currently must reflect the society it seeks. It doesn't right now. What does that mean? Well, it means that we are currently building products and services that aren't for everyone. And these products may reinforce privileges and biases. I recently finished reading Caroline Criado Perez's book, which is an absolute life changer. It's called Invisible Women, and it's all about data bias in a world designed for men. I definitely think that you should watch something a little bit calming before and after you read this, because like me, you might get a bit too fired up. But it really spotlights the ways in which a lack of diverse teams has led to bad products. And that means that some of these products and services have had fatal consequences. A really big one that I took from Caroline's book was around the seatbelt. When regulation was first introduced, the seatbelt was tested on crash dummies that were based on the design of an average man. So the dummy that was most commonly used was 1.8 meters tall and weighed 76 kg, which is significantly taller and heavier than an average woman in the UK. And that meant women got seriously hurt. It took until 2011, almost 60 years later, before female crash dummies started to be used. And I can't help but think that if there were more women around the table at the start of that conversation, that we would have never ended up in that situation. Another thing is that, a lack of diverse teams, especially as the pace of tech increases, means that you end up with a suboptimal product. Another example that I like to trot out is the fact that it's no surprise that the first smartwatches didn't have female health tracking features. An all-male design team just didn't think about how useful such a function would be to approximately half the population. Now, not only is that incredibly biased, but you're excluding half of your target market. So there's a bottom line element to diversity and inclusion as well. Something that my president, Jacqueline Rojas, the president of my organization, she's not the leader of a small nation, although I don't doubt that she could absolutely lead people. The president of techUK, Jacqueline Rojas, often talks about this issue, and it's something really close to our heart, and something that I've taken from her is her words, essentially. And she says things like, we live in interesting times where your university place, your mortgage, your job interview is all decided by an algorithm, and that algorithm doesn't necessarily cater for us all. Now, this has real tangible consequences for businesses who risk producing products, services, and solutions that do not meet customer expectations or scale effectively. And I think that really sums up what I'm trying to say, which is why inclusion matters so much as we charge on with our digital future. Data is influencing society and in our lives. New innovations from AI to virtual reality matters more than ever. And that's why representation matters. When diverse voices are excluded from discussions that shape these views, we push divisiveness at the forefront of our lives. Now, if we read the news today, we can see inequalities unfortunately dominate public debate. For example, if we take COVID-19, current evidence shows that those from a BAME background, which is Black, Asian, minority, and minority ethnic, have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Global events from last year have definitely been a wake-up call, in particular for the tech sector, about our need to actively tackle injustice and inequality, in fact. We need to do more to support those from minority backgrounds, because right now they don't necessarily have a seat at the table. And that's not just saying at kind of the entry level of entering into the tech sector or wider society. It means about elevating those around us. And for us at techUK, it's no longer to simply be non-racist. It's not a time for us to be neutral. We need to make proactive action happen. And this important realization and shift in attitude has really created some positive momentum for companies to have some honest and sometimes uncomfortable conversations about inequality and race. And it's accelerated companies' ambitions for meaningful change. And that's not just within techUK's membership. Now, I'm really proud that a lot of companies within our membership put out a Black Lives Matter statement. 6 months later, I, of course, went asking their HR teams and their senior leadership teams, that's fantastic. How have you progressed in 6 months? What are you doing to secure equitable futures, not only for your employees, but your wider communities? And it's been great to have these conversations, even though they may be uncomfortable, because when we don't do this, we all lose out. Now, something that has come up a lot recently is talk about the digital divide. And I know that a lot of you on this webinar right now will have done so much research into this. Now, while tech can do many things, I'm a big advocate, I also do worry that we have embarked on a digital by default, which I think was very much a tagline of the noughties, which has then morphed into a digital only path, which is excluding large chunks of the population. According to the Lloyd's Essential Digital Skills Report in 2021, currently 36% of working adults in the UK still lack the digital skills needed for work. And those skills, defined by the UK government, include communicating online, handling information and content, making transactions, and being safe online, which is a huge part of the work that we do at techUK as well. 6% of UK households lack regular and reliable access to the internet at home, either fixed or mobile. In a world that got more digital in an instant with, alternative channels of support being closed off, especially during lockdowns, we need to do more to ensure that no one is left behind. And often this kind of work, the digital inclusion piece, merges with the work that we do around gender, ethnicity, neurodiversity, and social mobility, because we need to look at this more holistically rather than siloed. These groups are disadvantaged in different ways. And so the more that we can do that will not only benefit these groups, but everyone, the better we can make use of the technologies that we have. Now, the reason for this digital skills gap has been researched and surveyed quite a lot. But for techUK, we see sort of a few things, obviously the access to devices, the infrastructure, but a lack of inclination and a lack of skills are frequently reported as reasons for not having engaged in the digital world. And I don't know about you guys, but during the first 2 lockdowns, I saw new groups of people, along with kind of those marginalized from society, emerged who lacked basic digital skills. And those were people who would go to the bank rather than do online banking, but they were still, they had 3 of the essential digital skills they need for work, but it's not all encompassing. Thankfully, companies, governments, and charities have acted swiftly to do whatever is possible during this crisis to support people. And that's fantastic. And as techUK, all we can say is keep that going. Let's not lose that momentum. One organization that did some really fantastic work is the Good Things Foundation, who helped over 10,000 people to cross the digital divide by providing devices, connectivity, and help people to learn how to benefit from the internet. Despite little promotion of this service, earlier this year, they still had a waiting list of devices of over 8,000 devices. And I think that's probably just increased since then. It's important for us not just to level up those at the bottom, those who are marginalized from society, but to make sure that everyone has the digital skills they need for their future, and not just those with higher level digital skills as we have previously focused on in the past. This is why techUK has been delighted to join the Digital Inclusion Impact Group, which is bringing together the combined knowledge and resources of public, private, and third sector organisations to tackle the UK's biggest modern problems. Other groups on that include DCMS, Code First Girls, Vodafone, Laptops for Kids, PwC, Future.now, MasterCard, and a few more. And we're really excited to be able to help coordinate a program of community-led activity and amplify existing initiatives, because I think that's a big thing about what needs to be done to help digital skills and digital inclusion. There are so many fantastic initiatives taking place all across the UK. What we have is a very fragmented landscape. So as long as we identify the projects, through on the ground insight, we can make sure that the group's funding mechanisms, and we're providing enough support to elevate the work that is happening in the most significant areas. For us, digital runs through every part of an organization, and therefore it runs through every employee. During the pandemic, we saw that over 2/3 of those who lost their jobs as a result were under the age of 25. There is a risk that without coordinated effort, the negative impact of the pandemic will be long-lasting for this generation. And as employers in the tech sector, we really want to work together with government and other organizations to stop this from happening. We know that good jobs will be created in the years to come, bringing with the opportunity for people to thrive. They cannot, however, thrive without digital skills. I put a tagline there, building back inclusively, because why not make slogans your own? In a nationwide poll of 10,000 16 to 18-year-olds by the Institute of Coding, more than half surveyed believed that the digital workforce lacks diversity, with 70% of those young people surveyed thinking the sector is entirely run by those of white British ethnicity, and over 1/3, that's 34%, think there are unequal opportunities for women. 1 in 10 admit they are actively discouraged from pursuing digital education and jobs due to the lack of people that represent them. When I first read these statistics, they sort of shocked me, because while these opinions, echoes some of the many things that the industry already feels, it's shocking that these perceptions of young people who have yet to enter the sector feel this way. And there is so much more to learning digital skills and digital education and digital literacy than working in the tech sector. There's so much more that we can do to support people, and that comes back to the inclusion piece that I've been going on about. This new generation of talent will take a while to come through. So against the backdrop of today's jobs crisis, we need to consider reaching out to those who are switching careers while also supporting those young people. And we are doing that by empowering young people to do things that we all know works. So things like showcasing role models in their organizations, including those from diverse backgrounds. Stories and case studies are of critical importance when inspiring and motivating someone to take the plunge and try something new. Other businesses in techUK have been highlighting the flexibility of roles and demonstrating clear career progressions. Other organizations are focusing on the importance of a mixed skill set, including soft skills such as leadership and critical thinking. I think it's interesting because we've been having these conversations for quite some time, and HR and talent teams have recognized that these are things we just need to do. But if we work to build targeted interventions, we will plot a quicker path to economic recovery, but also build a future that is more inclusive and more productive. So here are some of the most effective approaches from techUK's membership. We focus on sort of 4 main things: action in the community to inspire the next generation, attraction and recruitment, getting workplace culture right, and development of diversity. Now, the 4th one, development of diversity, really undercuts the first 3, but it's a retention point. How can we enable people in jobs that may not necessarily exist right now to feel included in the work that they do? I've also just created something pretty quickly on PowerPoint. It's a list of actions to build diversity. So going from the 4 key areas that we are looking to target, here are some demonstrated actions that have really been positive. And this list features evidence-based interventions that have been shown to positively affect gender equality. The findings were made by the GABI program run by the UK government and the Behavioural Insight team. Now, I know I've spoken a lot about kind of gender diversity, and while these kind of actions and concentrated efforts have only been reviewed to affect gender equality, but I think we can learn from what we've done with gender equality and build on that to make sure that we are focusing on other minority voices. And we're seeing that happen really well with regards to ethnic diversity and focusing on persons with disabilities. There's a lot that we can do to make sure we're talking about everyone quite in a way that's not siloed. Something else that we at techUK have been focusing on really on kind of making sure that diversity and inclusion has a positive impact on the future of work is ensuring broad representation, diverse senior leadership, and transparency in gender pay gap reporting, and building an inclusive culture. My Skills and Diversity Council, which is made up of 20 senior officials from techUK's membership across the organisation, so companies like Fujitsu, FDM, Costain, they are looking at ways in which they can do self-reporting ethnicity pay. And that's because they're all about the transparency. They're all about kind of implementing transparent pay and promotion processes. And while the government hasn't mandated this, we do see a future where this may be the case. We've done a lot of work on kind of the policy analysis of how that may work, which I'm happy to send around to all of those who have registered for this webinar. But the main point is that companies are starting to reflect internally, and they're starting to see differences in the way people react to certain internal comms, with how people react internally to kind of the culture that different teams have. And I think this will allow businesses to be more innovative, more profitable, and more attractive to talent. Something that techUK has helped launch is the Q for the Loo initiative, and it's a fantastic name, which highlights the stark sign of the lack of diversity in the cybersecurity industry, which is shown at cybersecurity conferences and events where women are in such minority, they rarely have to queue for the loo, unlike every other public event that women attend. The initiative was spearheaded by Microsoft and includes quarterly networking sessions for female cyber professionals to network, exchange ideas, and find mentors. The aim is to increase the breadth of talent within the industry and to make sure that women are included in tough and difficult conversations. A stark sign of success will be when women have started to queue for using the facilities at cybersecurity conferences. And from that, we have been doing a series of Women In events at techUK, but the last event that I did was around women in digital identity. Now, a lot of us may have received unconscious bias training through our company's sort of training manuals, the same way we do stuff on fraud, for instance, or biases. And the great thing about the event was that we didn't just have women show up, everyone was included, and we had loads of men come and join in the conversation. And it was really important because these are not issues that necessarily people in the room thought about on a day-to-day basis. So while I may be preaching to the choir, these are some initiatives and kind of concentrated efforts that we have taken forward to develop an inclusive agenda at work. I think they make a lot of difference, and despite it being really slow differences still make a massive impact. Something else that we've been doing at techUK is that we held a series of private and public roundtables talking about ethnic diversity in health tech. And we did this last year. And we had a few people on the panel. It was chaired by myself and led by the Health and Social Care Programme at techUK. We had a few nurses on the panel, and we had someone from the UK Trade Government. And we spoke about the representation of those from ethnic minorities within the NHS and health tech more generally, health tech companies. It was a really frank discussion. and oftentimes uncomfortable. It was talking about kind of the ways in which people react to others that are different to each other, and what the NHS has done right, for instance, mentoring, and what the NHS has not gotten right about supporting people, not just from minority backgrounds, but in general. That work led to a series of policy recommendations that the Health and Social Care team made as their 10-point plan for health tech, which was a follow-up for their manifesto for Matt, who was then Secretary of State for Health. After those conversations, my colleagues at the Justice and Emergencies Programme in techUK asked me to host a workshop looking at ethnic diversity in policing. And that provided the tech sector to really come together with policing partners to share best practice, challenges, and the use cases of technology in assisting and hindering the workforce of the future. These conversations that we have are so important, because that has fed into the work that we do and wider around digital justice. These conversations, as I've mentioned, super uncomfortable, but everyone in that room is keen to listen, and no question is a dull one. And because of these conversations, I'm here talking to you about the successes and the failures of that. The successes have been more people get involved in the work we do, and we have built a network of people really passionate about these issues and who are senior enough to make change. We've been able to talk to people, convince them, and lobby them about these issues. Some of the challenges we found: conversations can overrun. 2 hours, for instance, may not be enough time to talk about the systematic disadvantages that people face when working with the police, when being interviewed by the police. So there's so much more that needs to be done. And that's why techUK works with organisations such as UK Black Tech, Colour in Tech, and is a founding member and board signatory of the Tech Talent Charter, which is a commitment by organisations that they will take on a set of undertakings that aim to deliver greater diversity in the UK tech workforce, particularly one that reflects the society, reflects the makeup of the population. And we definitely understand that it can't be done alone, which is why we partner with so many fantastic organisations and leverage research from organisations such as Digit and share and elevate best practice. Importantly, the Charter states that all signatories must provide data on their own workforce every year. And that is so we can measure success and make more measurable changes as an industry for the future. Each year, the Charter produces a diversity in tech report, which is a snapshot of what we're seeing in the industry wider and within its own internal signatories. It also comes with a benchmarking tool, which I have constantly shared with all kinds of businesses so that they can measure where they are in comparison to others in the same industry. I think with greater awareness of organisations such as the Tech Talent Charter, the WISE campaign, PwC's techUK, we can work to towards giving better access and promotion to everyone. Just to end on, we need to do a better job of supporting people through change. And that includes preparing the young people that I spoke about in the beginning, who are not necessarily sure that the tech sector is for them, or kind of digital skills or jobs with digital are for them. And we need to do this by shaping what future leadership teams look like, in making sure that leadership teams will fully understand the needs of their workforce in terms of development requirements and requirements outside of work. The well-being aspect of the work that we do has really come to attention during the last few years. And as we care for our physical and mental health and navigate different ways of working, it's become even more important, our collective experience, as we work towards the future. Now, techUK, as I mentioned, has 830 member companies, which are sort of diverse in themselves. They operate across a number of sectors, and they all have their own individual hiring, training, and retraining practices. The journey that these companies are on with their diversity and inclusion practices are very different. However, the direction of travel is always the same. And I think by redoubling our efforts to increase diversity in the tech sector, we can not only work towards the normative and societal good of equal representation in the sector, but at the same time, take important steps to ensuring ethical and sustainable approaches to the development and use of training. Thank you very much for listening. I'd be very happy to take any questions. I'll hand back to Rachel.
Thanks, Nimmi, for a really great presentation. That was really fascinating to hear. So we've got plenty of time now for questions. If anybody wants to put anything in the chat, they're more than welcome to. And also, if you can use the raise hand in the reactions bar at the bottom if you'd like to ask a question. I think we've already got one there from UG Who. Would you like to, perhaps, if you're able to turn your camera on, ask the question if you're happy to? If not, perhaps I can. She's asking, or they're asking, what benchmarking tool you used. I think you mentioned that at the end of the presentation there.
The Tech Talent Charter has a fantastic benchmarking tool. I'm going to just pop it in the chat. You just have to sign up. I mean, the resources on the Tech Talent Charter's website are for free, and they've been collated by kind of industry experts. So I've just put that in the chat, and you don't need to pay to be a signatory or anything like that. And I just want to say I'm not a shell for them. I'm not a shell for them. They're just a really great organization that I've worked with continuously, who really focus on the D&I agenda.
Excellent, thank you. I think I might use my privilege as chair as well, just to butt in with some questions while people are perhaps thinking. You mentioned there, you kind of, on that slide where you talked about the interventions that have worked, which was really interesting. I wonder if, because we've got this now developing idea around best practice, haven't we, for what is helping in terms of diversity. If you have any kind of evidence, or you've done any work on what perhaps isn't working, and if that kind of information is also being shared to organisations. And then another point you mentioned at the start, you were talking about the gender pay reporting regulations, and I wonder if you know what kind of effect they've had in terms of the tech sector specifically. So has there been a decline, and what has that decline looked like, or has it not gone down? Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm going to probably answer the second one first, just because I've got that in my head. So King's College London have done some really good analysis on the impact of gender pay reporting in the UK. Now, techUK, I say we lobbied very hard for it to be introduced because, again, it's a data gathering method, and companies who are really invested in reducing their gender pay gaps will use it as an activity as part of their sort of quarterly or yearly progress reports on their retainment of talent. So, for instance, Fujitsu have done a phenomenal gender pay gap report where they not only analyze their numbers, but they highlight why they think this may be. They talk about kind of new entry routes and have they done enough to support learners? What's their flexible working policy? And they review that every year. And that is what is essentially missing from UK gender pay gap reporting in comparison to other countries. So the research that I'm going to put in the chat, they analysed reporting systems in the UK and 5 other countries: Australia, France, Spain, Sweden, and South Africa. And it found that the UK ranks joint last, I think, among the nations for the strength of its system, in part because it doesn't mandate that employers with pay gaps take steps to address them. It's just the reporting. And so that's the next step of where we go. Now, unfortunately, because of COVID, because businesses had different priorities, the Government Equalities Office suspended the kind of mandatory nature of gender pay reporting. I personally think that it was a cop-out, because companies at that point should have already reflected on their gender pay gaps and should have already done that kind of hard work, especially because it was the third year or the second year or third year. So it was very, companies were very prepared for this. And the moment you no longer make it mandatory, the easier it is to just see it as a bit of a phase, as something that companies don't need to necessarily think about. And so that's what we want to combat. We want to make sure that people are reducing their gender pay gaps with concerted efforts, and not just saying, well, we're doing these things, but there's no data behind it. A lot of the work that we do is naturally data-led, and that works for companies with over 250 employees in them as well. I've just popped the research in the chat. Rachel, I think you mentioned whether or not it's different in the tech sector. Yes, it is. There hasn't been as much analysis as I would like on the gender pay gaps of large tech organizations. There has been a lot of work done on kind of looking at the board level of tech companies and seeing how diverse they are. So I think we need to do more work on that as well.
Thank you. Ben Hopkinson has got a question in the chat here as well. Do you want to perhaps introduce yourself and put your question to Nimmi, Ben?
Hi, yeah, I'm Ben. I'm from UK Research Innovation. Thanks for a great presentation, Nimmi. So my question is that my understanding is that a significant portion of gender pay gaps in certain roles and sectors is essentially down to individual preferences and decisions. I personally think this is generally driven by sort of cultural expectations, societal pressures on individuals of certain races, ethnicities, genders, and how we raise children, how they're raised different in those areas. But it seems like this is going to create a sort of a supply side problem that is going to be difficult for organizations, either the person certainly specifically on their own, but also even collectively to manage. Do you think the primary role of organizations in sectors where that is a big barrier is to lobby government to run cultural campaigns, or do you think that at an industry level they should try to work together to sort of avoid the collective action issue of one person trying to invest much of money in university advertising to get more tech graduates that are diverse, and then every company scooping up that and a sort of tragedy of the commons situation?
That's a great question. Thank you so much, Ben. So we've seen in the tech industry, we've tried to take charge of kind of digital education and digital skills in terms of the reskilling and upskilling element. And at the end of the day, without government, I don't want to say intervention because that's the wrong word, but without government sort of campaigning, there's a wall that you hit with regards to how far you can go, which is why the government skills toolkit that came out during the first lockdown was so pivotal to the work that we do at techUK, because it was signposting to different tools that were already out there, that already highlighted the work that industry was doing. And it didn't necessarily provide these resources with a seal of approval. They just pointed people in the direction of these resources. And we saw so much traffic to, for instance, Cisco's Networking Academy and Google Digital Garage, just by targeting people who may not necessarily be within the tech sector's initial sphere of influence. And so I think that driving cultural expectations is something that government needs to do. And they're already doing it to a certain extent with regards to changing the narrative on apprenticeships. They're, using different campaigns like Fire It Up, and they're highlighting how apprenticeships aren't necessarily just for people who want to work in trades, but across kind of the work that people do. So they're really pushing on that angle. Unfortunately, right now, I think it's interesting that we'll talk about playing identity politics. And for me, identity politics is a huge part of just general politics, because our identities are who we are. So I try and sneak diversity inclusion into everything. And you know what? It works, because now my team at techUK, who work in the cyber and defense team, it is like one of their top 3 priorities: being inclusive, leading with inclusion. Those kinds of phrases make all the difference. And it's key to note that we're not just talking about gender and ethnicity, we're talking about kind of the whole thing around diversity of thought, regional diversity, social mobility, neurodiversity. So really, really a mixed bag answer there, I think, Ben, sorry.
Thank you. Got a couple more questions in the chat. First, if Andrew Pates, you'd like to put yours to Nimmi, and then Annie Hardy.
Cool, thank you. I really loved the session. Thank you very much. Really good to push this on EDI stuff. I'm really interested in the balance between carrying everyone with us on the legal standard, which you could call legal minimum, versus raising the bar, raising the standard on things which aren't legal obligations at the moment. So clear thing, we talk lots about gender pay gap. Where I'm from as a union, that's a real big thing we've been pushing for years. We push for it when it's voluntary, it's now mandatory. Things like ethnicity and other parts aren't quite part of the legal framework yet, but we kind of want to not just move everyone up, but then drag the best standards up. So it's just interesting in how, as techUK, you play that role as facilitator of the widest possible scale of improvement versus dragging us to a higher standard of expectation on these things. And I don't have a simple answer, which is why I'm asking you the question.
Thanks, Andrew. Of course, we don't want to put more legal pressures on people. That is not what we're about, especially when it comes to kind of making sure that we're not restricting innovation policies. But the way we see it is that it's data collection is away from kind of moving beyond just hashtags to real action. And it makes sure that we're able to measure the balance of people in the workplace, but not just, you know, I talk about diversity and inclusion in such linear ways, and that's something that I want to get across, that it's so not linear. It's just the broadest sense of collecting quantitative and qualitative data inclusion, which can enable organizations to understand areas for improvement, you know, use a baseline to set targets and measure progress. We used to work backwards. We used to set targets and then measure progress and then use the data to, you know, justify that. Now we're setting targets before we collect, after we collect data. You know, this data is so important to design interventions and build on evidence. And we recommend that companies publish data to improve transparency internally and externally, because the way we see it is that, especially if you're looking to recruit young people, it is such a priority for them, considering it's a buyer's market for where they want to go, where they want to work. And it's all about kind of building the right kind of culture. And that's why we push for it. I mentioned my Skills and Diversity Council. A lot of them are already self-reporting on ethnicity pay gap reporting. And now I'm unsure as to whether the impact of ethnicity pay reporting in the tech sector, because we actually do have a large BAME, even though BAME as a term is quite redundant, and kind of the number of BAME people in the sector, but also the differences between kind of Black and Asian minority populations within the work we do. I think for other sectors it could work better. So it may be that it needs to be kind of more reflective of regional diversity as well, because otherwise a lot of the work that ethnicity pay reporting will be central to London rather than anything else. I think once these come into practice, they won't be obligations anymore. It's just something you do, which is different than an obligation, I think, because you feel in time motivated to do it better every year. For instance, I mentioned Fujitsu's gender pay reporting. God, I'm plugging them so much, but I didn't mean to. It's just because I just had a look at this. Their first year report wasn't that great in comparison to their most recent report. They've built on it. They've learned so much from it. And eventually it's just something that they need to do, because they need to review the work that they're doing on this issue to retain their staff. I think that's what it comes down to. If we're talking about convincing HR teams and access talent teams and senior leadership on why this is important, people's bottom line, that's why.
Thank you. Annie, do you want to put your question to Nimmi now?
I have so many questions, but I'm going to limit myself to one of them. I actually put a question here, but I'm going to jump to a different question. The question I was asking was about social mobility. We talk a lot about gender and even starting to talk about neurodiversity, but we haven't talked as much about social mobility. But I'm not going to ask that question. I want to ask something else, because what I want to ask, I'm in the US at Cisco, by the way. So hi, UK people. But the question I want to ask is around keeping them. So what happens is we have a lot of, DEI initiatives where we're trying to acquire, we're trying to make, pull in people from diverse communities. But then what happens is that, what are people doing to keep them satisfied? for cultural communications awareness. I mean, we see a lot more about recruiting than we do about retaining. So can you talk to us about, especially in the UK, where there are gaps, what movement is happening? Just a little more about that. Thank you, by the way.
Of course, thanks Annie for joining, although from the States, I think it's pretty early there, so well done you. I've just put in a link in the chat on an article I wrote about social mobility in the UK tech sector. Some of it is applicable to your question, some of it's not. I also wrote it in January, so some of it is also redundant, so it's just a starting off point for you. Now in the UK, it's cheap, and I think this is across for US as well. It's cheaper to retain staff than it is to recruit new staff. I think that's always the case, right? I mean, that's business 101 or whatever. And we're seeing that workplace culture makes a massive impact on retainment of staff. And that's not just things like, do you have socials or the social aspect of the work that people do? It's about, if you've got flexible working policies, which now obviously everyone does, and hopefully companies are retaining those policies and not mandating people to go back to work. But are those policies actually trickling down from senior leadership teams, or does someone just enforce it and say, well, that's it? Because you may have a policy in a really large company, but it might not be getting through to everyone because line managers are either not aware of it or they don't agree with it. You know, they may think people need to be in the office 4 days a week. Some people might think 2 days a week. And that's a bit of a challenge. It's about training up your line managers to see that people work in different ways. And that can be hard in a large organization. There's a lot of noise about that. And I think that's where we need to put more effort into to retaining staff. Some of the retainment stuff, especially when you're a large organization, is tough because it's stuff on salary. But if the workplace culture is right, people will be less likely to leave. And I know that's a bit of a cop-out answer, Annie, I'm sorry, but there has been— I think
it's the natural progression, right? Once we get them in and we get the pipeline, how can we create a diverse environment into which they're entering so that they can feel comfortable, and so that productive work can happen, and so that their people aren't as offended, or they don't feel alienated, or the hostility reduces. Anyway, I guess it's just, let's just get our arms wrapped around increasing the amount of those communities present in each of the offices and kind of go from there. But all right, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of success with elevating those from minority backgrounds or minority voices to middle management or senior levels, because that's a real place in which we struggle in the UK. So it's, you get all these fantastic diverse people, or people with diversity of thought at the entry level, but then they go elsewhere when they see that there's not that much progression left for them in the company because they're not seeing people like them, or there's just not a place for them on the team. So that's where we really, really try to change the narrative around, well, the tech sector isn't, once you're in the sector, there's so much more that you can do at a higher level. And that's where the upskilling piece also comes in, because part of that is access to training and retraining.
And training people in the way that they need to learn based on their socioeconomic, higher education history and access. Okay. So interesting. Anyway, I could talk about this all day. Thank you very much.
Email me, Annie.
Thank you. I think we've got another question from Jackie O'Reilly in the chat. Jackie, I don't know if you're able to, from Madeira.
I'm not sure if the internet connection here is going to work, so I'll have to keep my video off. I just wanted to follow up on that question very briefly. I thought it was interesting your reference to Google Digital Garage and the other types of learning platforms you see with LinkedIn Learning. So there's a kind of really anarchic emergence of major organizations like Cisco putting out learning types of materials, often in short bite-sized ways, for people to accumulate some of these specific skills. So one question is, what does that mean for good old established giants like ourselves in the universities? Are these a threat? What do we need to adapt? And secondly, related to one of the earlier Digit debates from Vili Lendorvita, he found, doing a survey of online platform workers, some who were extremely well qualified and earning a lot of money, where they studied and what they studied didn't actually matter. What mattered were a particular set of very specific digital skills. So the question, in a sense, to Nimmi and also to Annie, the previous speaker, is will the future to enable more accessibility be around this kind of new, more innovative forms that people can accumulate particular skills? Do universities have to change, or do, relating to the point made earlier, organisations actually have to start recruiting not graduates but school leavers? Because these young people would be more likely.
Jackie, I think that's a really interesting question.
That's it.
I can't answer whether or not universities need to change. I cannot answer that. But what I can say is that universities are not a threat. There is so much work going on out there to make sure that people get the right kinds of skills they need at the time that they need. And what we at techUK constantly push is the applications of short modular courses, which of course the Open University has been going on about for years, and they work really successfully in what they do. But we're talking about short modular courses that are potentially accredited by industry. So for instance, another platform that I can plug is sort of IBM Learning, AWS training and certification. Doesn't necessarily, you know, the skills that are on these courses are of course important, but we did some research and we also found the same thing, that the accreditation and the certification is not exactly essential or prerequisite for certain digital roles, but they allow candidates to stand out. For kind of senior roles, they just focus on the brand or the reputation of a qualification. That doesn't really matter. It was more aligned around the specific skills within a course that worked with what the role was asking. It's definitely, you know, I think there is a number of different certification modes that are understood in the industry, and there doesn't really appear to be a great desire to kind of condense these into different industry offerings. Now, we think it's pretty transferable and acceptable and understanding to other sectors. So for instance, if you've got one of these, if you've done one of the Cisco Cisco networking academies, you should be able to do well in another organization, not necessarily just Cisco. And I think what's happening is that when we talk about kind of industry-led qualifications, we're just saying that this is what kind of provides job readiness, and that's where we see a little bit of a difference when it comes to universities, because obviously universities are focused on a different type. You know, job readiness is one of the key components of universities, but it's not the only component, whereas these courses are solely focused on this. For me, these short modular courses are phenomenal because they're easy to use, they're scalable, and people can learn on demand. And that's what people want when it comes to reskilling, upskilling. Universities are looking, or I guess are targeting a different set of people or people at a different point in their life, which is why I can't necessarily talk about the progression of that kind of whether it will challenge established education providers. But I can say techUK did some research on the future of work where we surveyed parents working in the tech sector. So we thought that parents in the tech industry will be able to provide, you know, more of an understanding of what they think about their kids' future of work and how they're going to, you know, what their kids' progressions are. And I'll put a link to that research in the chat. It was called something like Preparing Students for the Future of Work. Despite the fact that parents in the tech sector thought that, you know, qualifications like apprenticeships, T-levels would be more important in the future, a majority of them, and I think it was something ridiculous, like 85% of them wanted their kids to go to university. So there's still a whole cultural shift that will need to happen. And I guess that's used to happen for universities when we focus on kind of education. Now things are a little bit different. And the way I see it, it's not a challenge to universities, because we just want more people learning with different kinds of routes that support them, whether it's a skills bootcamp, whether they can take that time out. As long as they've got the skills that allow them to be job ready, I think the more the merrier. Where we come to is concerns of quality control and quality assurance with some of the courses. And that's why we always put forward kind of industry-led.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Nimmi. Well, thanks again for that brilliant presentation and for a great debate afterwards. A short poll, I think, is going to be appearing on the screen for everybody. If you could please take a moment to fill that in, that would be much appreciated. And we are looking like we're about to run out of time, and I can't see any more questions in the chat. So I just want to thank, as I say, Nimmi, but also the attendees for coming along today, and to invite you along to our next Digit Debate, which will be on the 10th of November, and that's with Steve Rolfe, one of our research fellows from the Digit Centre, and Mark Merrion, a partner at Evershids. And they're going to be talking about digital platforms and the future of social and employment protection. So we really hope to see you next time, and thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks all. Take care.